I was overseas. Thousands of miles away, in a time zone where night and day flipped. My biggest concern should have been staying alive. Not worrying about whether someone had the keys to my front door back home. But there I was, sitting on the edge of a cot inside a steel shelter, with sand whipping past the thin windows, staring at a message that nearly made my heart stop. "Hey, is your place on Oak Ridge Lane rented now? There's a family living there. Thought you moved back already." That one text flipped my entire world upside down. My house. My own home. The one I locked up before deployment. The one where I left framed photos, my old Marine Corps sword, my mom's recipe box, and everything I couldn't take with me. Rented out? While I was still on active duty. I didn't understand at first. I thought maybe it was a mix-up. Wrong address. Or maybe my buddy just saw a neighbor having guests over. But then more texts came in. One from an old coworker who lived 3 blocks away. Another from the mailman I'd known since college. Same story, strangers were living inside my home. They'd moved in a few weeks ago. Boxes, moving truck, porch light on at night, even a dog barking from the backyard. These weren't squatters. They had a lease. A real, signed lease with my name nowhere on it. Panic set in fast. I tried calling the property management company I had trusted. No answer. I emailed the HOA. They replied, but not with an apology. Not even with concern. Their response was cold, like reading instructions off a cereal box. According to Section 4, Paragraph B of your HOA agreement, the property was unoccupied and subject to use for temporary residency. Due to community maintenance standards and vacancy rules, we exercise temporary lease rights. I read that line 10 times. Lease rights? Temporary residency? This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. The HOA had actually leased my home. My private property. While I was gone, wearing a uniform, standing post in a country I can't even name on camera. And they did it like it was no big deal. Like it was just a Tuesday. The worst part? I wasn't just dealing with an empty house back home. It was occupied. Lived in. Someone else's toothbrush in my bathroom. Someone else's clothes in my closet. Someone else's car in my driveway. And I couldn't just fly home. I was in uniform, with active duty orders, halfway across the world. I was boiling inside. I wanted to call someone. Yell. Do something. But all I could do was sit on that cot, staring at that email, trying not to crush my phone in my hand. That's when one of my unit officers walked by. I must have looked pale or broken or something, because he stopped and asked if everything was all right. I told him what happened. Not in a long story. Just the basics. "Sir, my HOA rented out my house without my consent." His eyebrows lifted like I'd just told him aliens landed on my roof. "You serious?" he asked. "While you're deployed?" I nodded. That's when the military part of the story really started. Because when you're deployed and something like this happens back home, it's not just personal. It's federal. He told me, "You're covered. We're gonna fix this. Fast." It was the first moment I felt a breath of relief. I still had 1,000 questions. Is it legal? Can they do this? But the truth was, I didn't need to figure it out alone. Not when I had the backing of something a lot bigger than a housing board full of bored retirees. What happened next unraveled faster than I expected. And the HOA didn't see it coming. Not when the base commander got involved. Not when legal actions started moving across their desks within hours. Not when the paperwork flew in faster than their fake lease agreement ever could. But that moment, on that cot, in that desert, reading that cold email from the HOA, that's the part I'll never forget. That's the part where the fight started. Not with fists. Not with shouting. But with something stronger. And a team that doesn't leave anyone behind, even when the enemy wears a tie and calls themselves neighborhood management. It's strange how quiet rage feels. You'd think it would come with yelling or fists slamming on a table. But when you're in uniform, sitting on a military base halfway across the world, rage is silent. It just simmers. I couldn't scream. I couldn't call the tenants. I couldn't march into the HOA's office. All I had was a laptop, a phone with bad reception, and a growing list of questions that no one back home seemed in a hurry to answer. The HOA had decided, without my knowledge or permission, that my house was vacant and therefore eligible for short-term leasing. They actually cited neighborhood regulations about visible neglect, property inactivity, and occupancy minimums. I stared at those words like they were from a different language. I had kept the yard trimmed. I'd hired someone to check on the house every other week. My bills were current. The locks were changed before I left. And still, they called it abandoned. No, I didn't put a "for rent" sign up. No, I didn't authorize anyone. No, there was no foreclosure. No legal sale. Nothing. But they acted like it was their right to make use of my home in my absence. And here's the kicker: the tenants living there? They had no idea. They were a young couple. The wife was pregnant. They signed a lease handed to them by a third-party property manager hired by the HOA board. They moved in thinking it was all legit. And to be honest, I didn't blame them. They were caught in the middle of this just like me. But now my private mail was being sent to an address occupied by strangers. My security system was offline. And the keys I personally handed to a trusted friend had somehow ended up copied and handed off. The more I dug, the more disgusting it became. The HOA president, a man I had spoken to only twice, had taken it upon himself to handle property usage compliance. In other words, he decided my home needed to be lived in, or it would bring down the appearance of community stability. That's right. He actually wrote that in an email. Stability. Apparently, stability meant making a profit from an empty house that belonged to a deployed service member. It meant acting like the neighborhood was a resort, and empty homes were just assets waiting to be filled. I wanted to lose it, but I didn't. Instead, I contacted the JAG office, Judge Advocate General. If you've ever served, you know what that means. Military legal aid. The second I sent my deployment orders and the HOA's letter to their inbox, things started to move. The JAG officer didn't just reply. He called me. Straight to the point. They violated multiple parts of the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act, he said. What they did is illegal. And there it was. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't just angry. This wasn't a civil disagreement or a weird misunderstanding. This was federal. He explained how the SCRA exists to protect people like me, active duty members who can't be present to defend their property rights. Under that law, no entity, not even an HOA, can sell, lease, foreclose on, or change the legal status of a service member's property without a court order, and only after proving necessity. Spoiler alert, the HOA didn't have one. They didn't even try. And the fact that I hadn't even been informed? That made it worse. No letters. No notice. Just silent action while I was overseas. The JAG office looped in my base commander. Within hours, the chain of command had a formal letter drafted, signed, and faxed directly to the HOA board. The subject line alone probably gave them a heart attack. They were given 24 hours to vacate the unauthorized tenants, remove any third-party management contracts, and return full control of the property to me. No discussion. No delay. No compromise. I wasn't even the one who had to press the button. The commander made it clear, protecting the home of an active duty soldier wasn't a favor. It was policy. And trust me, when a letter comes signed from a base commander under the seal of Military Legal Counsel, HOAs don't argue. They obey. Back at the base, I sat in stunned silence. My whole body still felt tense, like I hadn't taken a real breath in days. But now the tide was turning. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was a soldier backed by law, and the people who thought I was powerless were about to learn just how wrong they were. The next morning, I got an email from my JAG contact with the subject line, confirmed, possession returning to owner. Just like that, it was happening. After weeks of stress and hours of emails, the ball was now rolling, fast. But what came next wasn't a quiet handoff or a polite apology. It was chaos. The HOA panicked. They had tried to play the quiet game. Rent out the house, collect the money, avoid attention, and hope no one noticed. But now the military was involved. Federal law was quoted. Their so-called authority was collapsing under the weight of real consequences. Within hours of receiving the letter from the base commander, the HOA's tone changed completely. The The same president who once quoted bylaws with smug confidence was suddenly nervous, unsure, and full of clarifications. His new email had words like unintended misunderstanding, administrative error, and temporary oversight. They wanted to explain themselves. They wanted to act like they didn't know I was deployed, as if that somehow made it better. But that excuse didn't fly. My deployment notice was on file. They had received it, stamped it, and logged it months before I even left. Every HOA gets those notices, it's required. They knew. They just didn't care until someone with rank made them care. What hit them even harder was the legal side. The JAG officer made it clear, this wasn't just about breaking HOA rules. This was a violation of federal protections under the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act, and the penalties could include fines, civil lawsuits, and even the termination of their board status. They had no legal standing. They had overstepped. Badly. The tenants, understandably, were stunned. When they were notified that they had to vacate within the day, they were shocked. I felt bad for them, honestly. They thought they were renting a clean, legitimate place. They had no idea they were caught in the middle of something they never should have been part of. I asked the JAG officer if I could speak with them. He arranged it through a mediator, and I got to explain the situation over a call. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just told them the truth. I'm deployed. This house is mine. The HOA rented it out illegally. I didn't even know you were there. The couple was surprisingly understanding. The husband, a former Army reservist, apologized repeatedly. They agreed to leave peacefully and even offered to pay for any damages or lost mail. That meant more to me than anything the HOA ever said. Meanwhile, the base commander followed through with full force. He contacted the Department of Justice military liaison and filed a formal complaint against the HOA. This wasn't just about one house anymore. It was about making sure this never happened again, to me or any other service member. The HOA scrambled to make things right. They sent someone over to check the locks. They terminated the fake rental contract. They voided all third-party agreements. They tried to look like they were cooperating, but by then it was obvious. They weren't sorry. They were scared. Neighbors started talking too. Word spread fast around the block. One of them emailed me and said, "I can't believe they did that to you. We all knew you were deployed." Another said, "They tried to rent my house last year when I was traveling for work. You just stopped them from doing it again." That's when it really hit me. This wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a pattern. A quiet little game the HOA had been playing for years. Target the empty houses. Use obscure rules. Slip in a tenant. Collect rent through third parties. Hope no one fights back. They just picked the wrong person this time. And I had something they weren't ready for. A commander who doesn't bluff, a legal team trained for war zones and courtroom battles, and a uniform that doesn't fold under pressure. Back on base, people kept asking me how it turned out. I told them the truth. My house is safe. But the fight's not over yet. Because the deeper we looked into it, the more we found, and I wasn't going to walk away just because they gave me my keys back. Not after what they tried to do. Not when I knew they'd do it again to someone else. After the tenants moved out and the locks were changed, I finally felt like I had some control again. But control didn't mean peace. Not yet. Because while the house was empty again, the mess the HOA left behind wasn't just physical, it was legal, personal, and loud. The mailbox was stuffed with mail that wasn't mine. Utility bills had been rerouted. My home insurance had been switched to a different name. My Wi-Fi account had been canceled and replaced. My alarm system had been disabled and reset by someone else. Every detail of my life had been touched, edited, or tampered with while I was gone. Like someone had taken a red pen and scribbled all over my privacy. When you serve in the military, you learn to plan for the unexpected. You plan for war. You plan for bad news. But no one prepares you for the day you come home to find that a board of neighbors decided your house was theirs to manage. That they had handed over the front door of your life to strangers and walked away like it was all routine. The JAG team was still building a case. They had stacks of emails, HOA notices, copies of the fraudulent lease agreement, and even screenshots of social media posts showing the tenants living inside my house. But what they were really after was a pattern. Because if the HOA had done this to me, they had probably done it before. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, I got a call from a reservist who lived 6 streets down. He'd heard what happened through the grapevine. His story sounded too familiar. He'd been away for 3 months training with his unit and came back to find a new lawn service hired by the HOA cutting his backyard weekly and billing him for it. Not the worst offense on paper, until he found out they'd also entered his home to inspect for pests without his consent. No notice. No key handed over. Nothing. Another neighbor, a retired Coast Guard vet, said his property had been listed on a short-term rental website for nearly 6 months without his permission. He only found out because a friend saw it online. Turns out, the HOA had been creating their own listings using old images taken during open houses or county surveys. They were running a rental scam under the radar using empty homes as profit tools. It was bigger than just me. That much was clear. My base commander encouraged us to gather the stories and report them together. He wasn't just supporting me out of obligation, he was furious. And when a man with that kind of rank gets involved, things tend to shift quickly. We compiled statements, email chains, legal documents, and logs of all unauthorized actions by the HOA. Everything was wrapped in a file and submitted to a federal military housing oversight team that handles violations involving service members. It felt like loading up a full magazine after weeks of fighting with just words. At the same time, local media began to sniff around. A reporter from a regional paper reached out after hearing whispers about a homeowners association renting out homes without permission. I didn't go on record. I didn't need the spotlight. But I gave him just enough to understand how deep this really went. The HOA's response? Predictable. They tried to spin it. They sent out a newsletter to the neighborhood talking about recent miscommunications and necessary adjustments to occupancy enforcement. They didn't mention me by name, but they didn't have to. The entire block already knew the story. And now people were watching them like hawks. Neighbors who used to ignore HOA meetings started showing up. People who never spoke out suddenly had questions about where their dues were going, why homes were being listed online without notice, and why the board kept hiring third-party property firms no one approved. What the HOA had counted on, silence, fear, and ignorance, was falling apart. They had overreached. They had been sloppy. And now, the people they once thought of as passive members were waking up. I still wasn't home yet. I was days from rotation. But somehow, it felt like I was already standing on my front porch again, except this time, I wasn't standing there alone. I had neighbors behind me, a commander beside me, and the law in my corner. And while they may have thought they could rent out my house without consequence, what they really did was rent out their reputation. And trust me, no one's paying to stay in that mess again. The day I finally returned home, nothing felt the same. I stepped out of the cab, duffel bag in hand, boots hitting the driveway I hadn't seen in nearly a year. My house looked untouched at first glance. Same porch light, same flag on the post, same flower bed edging my walkway. But as I took those first few steps, I could feel the difference in the air. I wasn't just coming back from deployment. I was stepping back into the middle of a neighborhood that had quietly turned into a battlefield. There was a note on my door. Not from the tenants. Not from the HOA. It was from a neighbor. Handwritten. Folded once. Glad you're home. Thank you for everything you did, especially for standing up. I read it twice before unlocking the door. Inside, the house was cleaner than I expected. The JAG office had sent a property manager to do a final sweep once the unauthorized tenants left. But even then it felt ugh. The furniture had been moved. The air smelled like a different detergent. My kitchen drawer where I kept my grandfather's pocket knife was empty. My photos were still there, but some were flipped down or out of order. It wasn't about things being stolen. It was the feeling that I had been erased from my own life for a few months. Like someone else had borrowed my identity and lived in it while I was gone. I set my bag down and just stood there, looking around at everything I had worked for. Every piece of furniture I had carried in, every wall I had painted. This was my home. And for a while, someone else had claimed it. I sat on the couch and just let it all hit me. I thought I'd feel victorious. Like I had won. Like the HOA had been defeated and now all was well. But instead, I felt a quiet kind of exhaustion. Because winning didn't erase the violation. Winning didn't unlive the months I spent worrying whether my house would still be mine when I returned. Later that night, I went through the mailbox. Buried between the bills and catalogs was another letter from the HOA. This one was different. It wasn't legal. It wasn't bolded or underlined or filled with regulations. It was an apology. A formal letter signed by the president and 3 board members. They acknowledged what had happened. They admitted they had failed to follow protocol. They admitted they knew about my deployment status. They admitted they were wrong. They even offered to waive HOA fees for a year, as a gesture of goodwill. But here's the thing about goodwill. It doesn't erase bad faith. I wasn't looking for free dues. I didn't want money or handouts. I wanted accountability. I wanted change. I wanted to know that what happened to me wouldn't happen to the next young soldier who deployed thinking their home would be waiting for them. So I didn't take the apology at face value. I made a copy of the letter. I sent it straight to JAG, the commander, and the Housing Oversight Office. A few days later, I was invited to a private HOA board meeting. I showed up in civilian clothes, but the mood in the room shifted the second I walked in. Eyes lowered. Chairs shuffled. It was quiet. They let me speak. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I just told them what they had done. Not just to me, but to this entire community. How they had lost trust. How they had used power without understanding the responsibility that came with it. And how one board's arrogance almost broke the law that was supposed to protect every single person wearing a uniform. I ended with one line, "You're not in charge of this neighborhood, you're supposed to be serving it." They didn't say much. They just nodded. Some looked embarrassed. Others just stared. After that, changes started happening. The rental policy was rewritten. Military protections were added to the bylaws. The third-party rental firms were banned. Board members resigned. New elections were called. The community, once quiet and divided, started talking again. The fight that started with an email in a desert turned into something bigger. And while the uniform helped get their attention, it was the truth that made the difference. Because even though I was gone for months, this was still my home. And now, finally, it felt like it again. It's funny how you can live somewhere for years, pay your dues, mow your lawn, wave to your neighbors, and still not truly see what's going on behind the scenes. That's what hit me hardest after I came home. It wasn't just about my house being rented out without permission. It was about how easily a group of people with clipboards and nice signatures could turn power into a weapon. And for a while, they got away with it. After I spoke at that HOA board meeting, people started reaching out, quietly at first. Notes left in my mailbox. Emails sent from personal accounts. A few folks even stopped me during walks around the block. Each one had a story. Not all as extreme as mine, but enough to see a pattern. One neighbor said her landscaping had been redone without her consent, then billed to her account. Another told me the HOA had warned her to consider selling after her husband passed away because her house didn't fit the new design vision. She thought she was alone, thought it was just bad luck. But now she saw it for what it was, bullying disguised as policy. I started writing all of it down. Not to build a case, but because it needed to be known. These were the same people who were told they signed up for community values, only to find out it really meant signing away their say in their own homes. Meanwhile, the story kept spreading. That regional reporter? He wasn't done yet. Turns out, there were similar complaints in other neighborhoods nearby, HOAs taking over vacant homes, renting them out through backdoor companies, and hiding the profits through maintenance fees. Once you peeled back the layers, it was all too clear. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were running a side business. The piece finally came out, front page of the Sunday section. HOA overreach, when community power turns against homeowners. My name wasn't in it, but everyone knew. I didn't want credit. I just wanted change. And now it was spreading faster than they could contain. Then came the calls from veterans groups. I spoke with one advocate who said, "This isn't rare. You'd be shocked how many deployed service members lose property while serving." That made my blood run cold. All those stories you don't hear. All the men and women overseas right now, fighting with everything they have, trusting the system back home will take care of their lives while they're gone, only to return to foreclosure notices, legal threats, or, like me, strangers in their house. That's when I realized this wasn't about my neighborhood anymore. It was about awareness. If this could happen in my quiet Texas suburb, how many others were quietly getting rolled over? The base commander supported me the whole way. He even hosted a training session on post, inviting military families and base legal experts to teach service members about their housing rights, especially under the SCRA. I stood up and shared my story, and from the nods in the room, I could tell I wasn't alone. Later, one young soldier came up to me and said, "I almost didn't file my deployment notice with my HOA. Didn't think it mattered. But now I will." That moment made it all worth it. Back home, the new HOA board was holding its first meeting. This time, it wasn't just the usual 3 members and a stale coffee pot. The room was full. People who had never shown up before were asking questions, challenging rules, demanding transparency. A neighbor suggested setting up a committee just to handle military-related protections. Another proposed opening the books, showing where the money had gone over the last 5 years. These weren't wild ideas. They were basic expectations. But they only came after people saw what unchecked power could do. I didn't take on this fight expecting to lead anything. I didn't want to be a symbol. I just wanted to come home to my house and find it the way I left it. But sometimes, life doesn't wait for your permission to put you in the center of a fight. Now, I look around the neighborhood and see something different. Not just trimmed hedges and neat driveways. I see people who've woken up. People who realized silence doesn't protect you, it invites more abuse. And when one person stands up, others find their voice too. You know what surprised me the most after all of it? It wasn't the fact that the HOA had overstepped so badly. It wasn't even the lies or the fake lease. It was how many people told me quietly that they thought something like this was just the way things worked. As if losing control of your own home while serving your country was somehow normal. As if signing a homeowner's agreement meant giving up the right to your front door when you're not physically there. I heard that phrase again and again, "That's just how H's are." And I started thinking, when did we all just accept that? When did we decide that a board of neighbors, elected by a handful of votes, could become landlords, enforcers, even property managers without any pushback? The more I thought about it, the more it became clear. People don't push back because they don't think they can. Or worse, because they think they shouldn't. And that's exactly what HOAs like mine rely on. They count on people being too busy, too tired, too distracted to show up to meetings. They rely on rules being written in legal jargon nobody wants to read. They hope the average homeowner will feel just intimidated enough to not ask questions. And when someone does ask, they throw policy at them like a shield. But here's the truth, policies can't outrank the law. And certainly not federal law that protects military families during deployment. No HOA rulebook overrides that. But unless someone challenges them, they act like they can do anything. After this whole mess, I started reading. Not just my own HOA documents, but others. Friends sent me their HOA contracts from nearby neighborhoods. And what I found was alarming. Some had vague clauses that gave the board temporary management rights during extended absences. Others had vague language that allowed them to enter property for inspections, with little or no notice. Some even included quiet lines that allowed them to reassign use of vacant homes for community benefit. Most homeowners sign these agreements without a second thought. They're handed the paperwork at closing, told it's just standard stuff, and they sign. Then life moves on. Until it doesn't. Until someone comes home from deployment to find a lock changed. Until someone misses a notice buried in legalese and ends up with fees they can't explain. Until a retired couple wakes up to find their front yard listed on an HOA improvement plan and half their landscaping torn out overnight. We've been told these boards are here to protect property values. But somewhere along the way, some of them stopped protecting and started controlling. Not all HOAs are corrupt. I get that. Some genuinely care. But the ones that abuse power ruin trust for the rest. And worse, they put people at risk, especially people like me who are away serving and can't be there to push back in real time. The more I learned, the more I felt a sense of responsibility. Not just for myself, but for the people around me. Because if I didn't speak up, loudly and clearly, then the next guy might not be so lucky. The next soldier might not have a commander who moves fast. The next homeowner might not have neighbors willing to back them. That's why I kept showing up. To the meetings. To the legal calls. To the community forums. Because change doesn't just happen when something goes wrong. It happens when people decide not to let it happen again. I started helping others file complaints. I worked with a legal team to create a simple guide for military homeowners. What to file, what to track, and how to fight back if something seems off. We shared it around base. We gave copies to every new service member heading out on deployment. And slowly, the fear that had once hung over this neighborhood started to fade. People began to ask more questions, raise hands in meetings, call out strange fees, and challenge mandatory policies that made no real sense. What happened to me shook this place up, but in the best way possible. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I needed a win. But because I realized how many of us were living under rules we never agreed to enforce blindly. It took one unlawful lease to wake up a neighborhood, one soldier's house to expose a pattern, and one loud voice to remind everyone else that silence isn't peace, it's permission. The emails didn't stop, even after everything was resolved. Every week, another message from someone in a different state, different branch, different HOA. Soldiers, reservists, veterans, all sharing the same kind of story in their own words. My HOA changed my locks when I was overseas. They tried to foreclose because I missed 1 month of dues while I was deployed. They rented out my house claiming it was abandoned. I was stationed abroad. It was like looking into a mirror again and again. And it made me realize what happened to me wasn't rare. It was just hidden. Most of these people weren't trying to stir drama. They weren't asking for sympathy. They just wanted someone to listen. Someone who understood that being in uniform doesn't make your property less yours. That serving your country shouldn't come with the risk of having strangers sleep in your bed because a few neighborhood officials decided they could get away with it. I started responding to every message. Not with legal advice, I'm not a lawyer, but with steps. With what worked for me. With what didn't. I shared the wording I used in emails. The SCRA forms. The contact info for base legal assistance. I told them how to write timelines, gather receipts, track emails, and save voice messages. Most of them had no idea they were even protected under the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act. That's how little awareness there was. One guy from Arizona told me his HOA was charging him for weekly maintenance while he was in Iraq. They'd installed a sprinkler system without telling him, then billed him over $20,000. No warning. No approval. Just a letter with the amount and a late fee. I walked him through what to send to his JAG officer. 2 weeks later, the bill was wiped clean and the board issued a formal apology. Another was a Navy pilot out of Florida. He'd left his condo in the hands of his cousin while on deployment, but the HOA insisted it violated the community's non-family rental clause. They tried to evict the cousin. The pilot never even got a phone call. By the time he reached out to me, the cousin had already moved out. All because someone on the board decided it was non-compliant housing. These weren't just frustrating stories. They were dangerous. Because every time something like this happens, it chips away at morale. It breaks trust. It sends a message to service members that while they protect their country, there's no one protecting what they left behind. So I kept going. I started compiling a checklist, something clear, simple, that anyone could follow. Step 1. File your deployment orders with your HOA in writing. Step 2. Request confirmation in writing that your property will not be modified, rented, or entered without your permission. Step 3. Assign a representative, someone you trust, to check in every 30 days. Step 4. Keep all HOA communications archived. Every email, every letter. Step 5. Contact your JAG office before deploying and again the moment something feels off. People began sharing it across base pages, forums, even veterans' Facebook groups. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And something is better than silence. HOAs can serve a purpose. They can keep neighborhoods looking clean, protect community property, and make sure everyone follows agreed standards. But when they start operating like landlords, lawyers, and real estate brokers, unchecked, unsupervised, that's when the system breaks. That's when they forget that homeowners aren't subjects, they're the ones in charge. There was a woman in my own neighborhood who came up to me one afternoon while I was cleaning the garage. She wasn't military. She wasn't involved in any of the board decisions. But she said something I'll never forget. You know, for a long time I thought HOA rules were just how it had to be. But after what happened to you, I read every line of that handbook. Every single line. And now, I finally understand what they can and can't do. That was it. That's the win. Not courtrooms. Not news headlines. Awareness. Accountability. Neighbors talking to neighbors. Not being afraid to question authority just because it wears a different kind of badge. So I kept replying to the emails. I kept helping where I could. Because the moment one person speaks up, 10 more realize they're not alone. And then the silence breaks for good.